Here is the Chucktown Wind Report Extended Outlook from Monday, July the 13th through Friday, July the 17th. So we do have lots to talk about this week when it comes to what's going to happen with our winds, and a lot of it is going to have to do with these boundaries, these segments of boundaries that keep popping up in our region. And when I discussed the last time in our prior forecast, when we have these bulging and sort of rippling boundaries that are called undulating fronts, and that's sort of what I'm expecting to happen over the next couple of days. I do think that we'll get something very similar to this, where we have a front drop down all the way through the area by perhaps Thursday. We'll get to that in just a minute. So the first thing I want to talk about is the Bermuda High. Now the Bermuda High pressure is somewhat weak. We're only getting about 1,012 millibars right at our coastline. The main bulk of the high pressure is very far removed to the east. It's more characteristic of an Azores high this go around, and as tomorrow I think as tomorrow comes around, we may get another lobe of high pressure build in over this way to sort of connect while this piece of boundary lifts out of the area, and we'll get a little bit of a stronger Bermuda high built back in, more of a Bermuda Azores high. But it should be able to get that southerly synoptic flow really kind of peeling up the coast again. And I think with some of the inland troughing characteristics that we have coming down across or downsloping from the mountains, I do believe that we'll be able to get some moderate and even possibly strong levels of winds for tomorrow, possibly upper teens to low 20s, maybe a few higher gusts. But I am concerned about the storming element, and the reason why is because of this giant ridge of high pressure over the Gulf of Mexico. These surface highs that you see here and here, they're just sort of placed there. They're not a definite location. Your mid-level ridge is somewhere about here, and that's causing your mid and upper level winds to sort of drive this moisture down into the southeast. And some of these mid upper level winds are somewhere between 20 and 40 knots, which isn't that much, but it's just enough to keep those cloud tops moving the storms down through the area. And that's exactly what we saw today with these thunderstorms that sort of drifted down to the southeast over the coast and sort of contaminated the sea breezes, where we had storms that totally overran the coastline, and the sea breeze was still trying to undercut it. So I saw some low-level clouding on observations actually being driven back inland. So there was sort of a rolling of the atmosphere, and the storms really fizzled out along the coastline because of it. And the sea breeze has actually been very protective of some of these coastal storms the last week or so. So when we get into this inland troughing, we really need a strong convergence line to develop inland in order for that return flow to come back out into the ocean and back into the sea breeze. So we'll have to see what tomorrow's profile looks like. But for right now, I think tomorrow we're looking moderate to strong, but we really need to watch out for this giant ridge of high pressure to drive these storms down into the southeast and then possibly overhead over the coast. I think there may be enough of a gradient from the southerly winds pushing this way to be able to keep the undercut going. There may be several ups and downs, but during some of the clearing times and more abundant sunshine, I think we'll have some of the higher numbers. So let's take a quick look at the weather balloon from tonight. Now this was at 7 p.m. and you can see some of these higher readings. When we look at the weather balloon, they're called Raywin sondes, and they are weather balloon observations or soundings, if you will. So we see some of these mid-level winds or westerly, which is good because that's pushing the bulk of the cloud, some of the thicker clouding, towards the coast, which actually creates an area of convergence, which I did see today. However, this afternoon we did see some of those storms. Some of those clouds were still being pushed out over by these northerly upper level winds, and we had 40 knots here and we had 25 knots here. Basically about 25 to 40 knots overall for your northerly winds. And what that does is it drives the cloud tops from north to south. And then when you have a westerly wind, the mid-levels, you end up with a basic northwest general flow. So that's why we had northwest to southeast traveling storms today. So if we look back at, let me undo the thing there. If we look back at this morning's, we'll probably see some stronger winds aloft, and that's exactly what we had. So we actually had pretty solid 30-35 knot northwesterly winds at those mid-levels, and then some other various directions, but about, I would say, 25 to 40 knots overall from that direction. So that's kind of what we're looking at today for our storm setup. Now for tomorrow, it depends on that ridge over the Gulf as to how fast or how often these storms are going to be able to make it over the coastline. I do believe that we'll have a strong enough sea breeze front onshore just inland to be able to kind of hold some of that convection at bay for a little while. But as the day goes on, if that northwesterly flow picks up at all or that ridge builds, then we could be seeing an overrunning of thunderstorms throughout the day with a little bit of building back and then maybe getting overrun again. So let's take a look at the radar for today, what happened. And I'm going to put this one in play, and you'll be able to see that we had a line of storms and they're traveling from northwest to southeast. And you can see that area of convection that developed right along our coastline. And if we look at the direction of these storms, we'll see this direction right here overall, and you can see where they sort of stall out for a little while because the sea breeze front held it at bay, but it had already overrun the coast, so the sea breeze front receded back offshore temporarily and then came back on. But you can see as it goes on, some of that convection just kind of flared up the coast a little bit more where that sea breeze front was meeting it, and the actual convergence zone was pushed right along the coastline. And that happened up in southeast North Carolina as well, where it held for a bit and then overran the coastline. And you can definitely see that northwest to southeast flow of all these storms. So that's kind of what happened. Now take a quick look at Charleston. Right now we're seeing a sort of a general, here's our northwest flow. We've got a few thunderstorms in the area, and I'll look at radar here in just a minute. But I wanted to go ahead and take a quick peek at the modeling for tomorrow. We got 8 knots west-southwest at Sullivan's Island. I'm going to go ahead and select all models and give that just a minute to load. And for tonight our North American model, 12 kilometers, showing a little bit of a nocturnal jet. And that would be typical of frontal boundaries in the vicinity of the southeast region. Even if they're far away, we can still see nocturnal jetting at nighttime go beyond what we would see in the daytime. And sometimes it can be a good indicator of what's going to happen for the day. So we'll have to see how tonight plays out as far as that goes. But for tomorrow, you can see some of the models are starting to jump around a little bit. I think earlier, a couple days ago on the quick look at kite surf and wind alert, that we were seeing 20s and gusting up near 40 miles an hour. I don't think that's realistic, though. I think that we're more apt to see something like this where we're in the mid to upper teens and then possibly near 20 miles an hour, 20 knots. And you can see some of these models, they're just really jumpy because they're all trying to read even the higher resolution models. The North American model 5 kilometer, which is a higher resolution model, is kind of up and down based on the fact that it's picking up thunderstorming activity and some of the inland troughing making it over the coastline. And each of these models have their own opinion about it. My opinion for tomorrow would be, as I said earlier, mid to upper teens with possible near 20. But we will have to watch for those ups and downs. And as we get into Wednesday, where you see the models really start to jump around on speeds, and that's mostly due to what's going to happen with the fronts. And if the fronts bulge down into the southeast region, then we'll see probably a little bit more jumpiness and more of a west-southwest flow as that northwesterly push tries to overrun the sea breeze, which ends up becoming more of a west-southwest flow. So if we look at that on a surface map, when we have this ridge, if it builds and we have this northwesterly sort of flow coming down the mountains, down the slopes, and then we have this southerly wind and this Piedmont troughing, inland troughing, maybe lee side coming into the coastline, they try to get a westerly flow going from the ridging over the Gulf, and then as your southerly winds are coming up, winds will eventually steer to the west-southwest, and that's looking like what may happen on Wednesday. So we could end up with kind of a corkscrewing pattern for Wednesday, where you see a westerly flow fighting against a southerly flow, and where there's punchiness in between. So that's something to definitely watch out for. And when we talk about where the front was today, the sea breeze front, we did have a fairly well sea breeze front established right about in this area, and as the convection started lining up, we had that northerly push. The storms went from north to south and eventually breached the coastline, and then we saw the sea breeze front sort of break off and propagate inland, and so those values fell off very quickly. And what we saw as a result of that this afternoon was a southeast flow off of a pure sea breeze to Sullivan's Island and Olive Palms, and then we still saw a south-southwest wind at Folly Beach still holding in the low to mid-teens. And even in the harbor, we saw a southeast flow. So we had a pure sea breeze, a corkscrew sea breeze, pass over to pure sea breeze north of the harbor where the storms rippled through, and then to the south below the boundary is where it actually held. So for tomorrow, I think we're going to be able to escape that and have a pretty solid south-southwest flow widely. As we get into Thursday, I do think that we're going to see, let me get out of this map. Okay. As we get into Thursday, I do think that we're going to have some Canadian high pressure dropping down and pushing this boundary, and we may actually see something that looks like this by Thursday. And as this boundary pushes down through the region, we'll see that northeast wind, maybe even east-northeast wind off a backdoor sea breeze accelerate down the coastline depending on how strong that high pressure is dropping down from Canada. Now, we don't typically see them that strong this time of the year because the polar jet has not actually dipped to the south at this point. We're still working off the subtropical jet, which is coming up from the Pacific and up across the country. And that's what's riding around this ridge actually over the Gulf. So it really depends on the high pressure to the north as to what our northeast and east-northeast backdoor sea breezes are going to be doing as we get into Thursday and Friday. But I do think we'll see an easterly flow above that boundary, and that boundary may be as far down as here. It will start to fizzle out, so as that boundary does fizzle out, we could get back into our southerly winds maybe by Friday. It just depends on what happens with the high pressure to the north. So I think that will do it for the Chucktown wind report. And once again, tomorrow's forecast will be, as a recap, we'll say moderate winds, mid to upper teens to near 20 at times, fairly gusty. Watch for thunderstorms, watch radar. We also will carry that into Wednesday with a possible west-southwest flow, and that may be getting into sort of corkscrewing effect where the northwest or westerly winds are trying to fight with the sea breeze, and then that ends up having more of a westerly flow in the harbor and a southwest flow on the beaches that tends to go back and forth. As we get into Thursday with the frontal boundary, could be right over us. We may be looking at a southeast flow right along it, and then a somewhat building easterly flow above it. And that could go to low to mid-teens. We saw that this past Sunday where the winds actually picked up to 15 knots and slowly faded out. I think that that may happen on Friday if the front pushes further enough south and we get a stronger Canadian high. Then we do have a definite chance of that happening. If not, the front will fizzle out and we should get back to a modest southerly flow. So that will do it for the Chucktown wind report, and have a good week.